Catus Maximus here. I have a review of a vintage wood handle screwdriver set, Great Neck, which is now just a nothing brand. They've been sold out a bunch of times, or I suspect a bunch of times. Used to be a pretty decent company. I believe it's referring to Great Neck, New York, which is like, or excuse me, yeah, New York State, about 15 miles northeast of New York. Anyway, they were a pretty decent tool company for a long time. I know, especially through the 80s and early 90s, and then something really, I think they just got sold out. Something really changed, and now the name Great Neck is still around, but it's really just, they're like PT tools. They're just really bottom of the barrel kind of tools. These are vintage. Certainly know that because these are American-made wood handle screwdrivers. But I will point out that they are not as good as, say, the Irwin wood handle screwdrivers. This is indeed a 5-piece set, but it's a very odd 5-piece set, because what we have here is 5 flathead screwdrivers and then 1 Phillips, which happens to be like a number 2, or excuse me, a number 1 Phillips, a pretty small Phillips, and the cuts on it don't quite have the same shape as a normal Phillips does. Like on this old Irwin USA, it was back when Phillips was still patented, or the Phillips had design, so they are part of the conditions of using their patent, licensing it, was the fact that you had this roll stamp on Phillips and like the whole patent and license number. That, of course, doesn't exist on this Phillips. Always thought that was a little strange. It should have just been 5 flatheads. Why include 4 flatheads and then 1 little Phillips? Now, the other issue that I have here is we compare similar size screwdrivers here. What we have is similar length in both the Great Neck and the Irwin. The Great Neck has no stamping of Great Neck. All it has is made in USA, stamped in right there. But what I was noticing is that there appears to be some kind of universal pattern to these screwdrivers. If we look, the handle is just a little bit slightly different on the Irwin than it is on the Great Neck. I don't believe the same company made both these screwdrivers, but it is possible. But for 2 screwdrivers of the same length, I believe these are going to be 12-inch long screwdrivers, 3/8 wide flathead tips. But we can see the shank on the Great Neck is just not quite as thick as it is on the Irwin. So they were a bit cheaper, even when they were American-made tools. Of course, the other issues with wood handle screwdrivers, really the big issues with wood handle screwdrivers, isn't the cost of wood or working with the material. It's actually very cheap. It's the fact that it gets soaked with water, it can rust, it's not as strong at all, particularly if you're doing prying operations. That's why they do this reinforcing, but this shank only goes up just so far into the wood handle, so they just aren't super strong, and it's pretty easy to break and damage the wood handle. Acetate ended up being so much better than wood for things like tools, is why it took over, why that plastic took over. And that's why you hardly see wood handle screwdrivers. So really, wood handle screwdrivers are more for assembling furniture, assembling woodworking items, that type of thing, rather than heavy duty automotive and industrial use, because the wood just doesn't take it. Particularly if it gets left outside and soaked with water, then the wood will expand, and then when it dries off it contracts, and then it makes the reinforcing collar loose, makes the shank loose. And that's really why they went away. But there is some advantages to it. It just has a nice warm feeling, wood handles do. If it's really cold outside, the wood is not as freezing as metal. If it's really hot outside, it's also not quite as slick when you have sweaty hands. And so there's something to be said about wood handled screwdrivers. You just have to remember that they're not as heavy, they're not totally super duty like modern acetate. Actually, I shouldn't even say modern acetate, because acetate handled screwdrivers has been around for 70 years or something like that. Anyway, just wanted to do a little video that Great Neck did indeed have American-made tools. And they had this neat little slot, head with an oddball set that was a wood handle set. But they just weren't quite as good as some of their competition, like the old school Irwin USA made ones. But I could have swore that they were the very same ones. But they're not. We can see some other things like just the varnish or whatever they put on to treat the wood just isn't quite as deep or as heavy a coat as the Irwins. They were a little bit cheaper, even back in the day. But it's kind of interesting. I always think it's fascinating when you find particularly something like this, which is essentially a new old stock, but this is going to be old stock from, who knows, 1970s or something like that. Half century old, new old stock screwdrivers. Hardly any corrosion. These just sat in somebody's garage, grandpa's garage. He bought them, thought they were neat, and then never let anybody use his precious wood handle screwdrivers. He never even used his precious wood handle screwdrivers until, unfortunately, time came. And what ended up happening, the kids didn't care about his wood handle screwdrivers because he never let anybody use them, and they just got they ended up just getting rid of them. Actually, I have no idea if that's true, but you know, that's kind of how I feel. I collect tools, but I don't mind using them because I just try to find tools that for more abusive applications and then use other tools for more mild applications. But I do like to get a feel for them, because if you don't use something, I mean, and even coming from a collector, I try to find a balance of, you know, turning over stuff, getting rid of stuff, and using stuff just to get a feel for what the vintage tools look like, because quite frankly, tools are meant to be used. And they're not the type of collectible item like so many other things, old watches or something like that. Anyway, just wanted to make a video documenting these old school great neck wood handle screwdrivers. And once again, if you see these on eBay or Craigslist or something like that, and somebody's charging some outrageous amount of money, they really weren't that great. You know, they aren't worth as much as, say, the Irwin ones or several other brands of that were much nicer. But this is still kind of a cool find, and did want to share it with you all. I think the last thing to mention is these blades, interestingly enough, are both forged and ground. How we know that is they just take the square, they squash it, and we can see how it splays out. So that is a forging process. It may not be a it may not be die forged, it may have just been some rollers, but they did upset the metal. That is a forging process. And then they just grind the sides flat, so they do have a nice square edge. And interestingly enough, for some reason, either I think they just missed carburizing this particular shank on this thin one, because all the other, it just seems so out of place with the rest of its brothers here. How that one's shiny and the rest will have a nice carbon finish, so not the 100% perfect quality control either. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing, and if you haven't subscribed, please do. Till next time, Catus Maximus out.